this, you can see this clearly in the life of Galileo, right? That he, like Kepler, also advocated that the earth revolves around the sun. The Christian church accused him of heresy, forced him to repent, and imprisoned him in his house in 1615, right? So, to the intellectuals who were living in Europe at the time, they saw religion represented by the Christian church, and they saw science represented by this explosion of scientific knowledge, and they chose to go with the science rather than the religion, which was represented by Christianity. So the combination of these two factors of Christianity and its contradictions and the explosion of scientific knowledge paved the way for the spread of atheism in Europe. Okay? So it's a very specific set of circumstances that Europe experienced that led and paved the way to the growth of atheism. So if we compare the atheistic, materialistic concept of the universe, right, we will see that it overlaps with ours as regards two sources of knowledge, that is reason and empirical knowledge, but it contradicts and goes against our faith in one source of knowledge, which is revelation. Right? So we accept revelation, reason, and empirical knowledge as sources of knowledge. They accept reason and empirical knowledge as sources of knowledge, but they deny revelation as a source of knowledge, whereas we affirm it. And this is the fundamental difference between atheism and Islam. Okay? Right. So now we can see what sort of world conception, what sort of ideology these atheists advocated. What was their ideology? How did they approach the world and knowledge? So their basic premise was what? Rejection of revelation, which they saw in the guise of Christianity. Okay? Rejection of religion, which they saw as a force of backwardness, as a force of sporting, rich aristocrats, which they rejected, right? And so it starts with what? Atheism starts with negation of revelation as a source of knowledge. Okay? And that becomes manifest in society through secularism. Right? Since revelation is not a source of knowledge, they will argue what? That a society that is enlightened cannot be governed by religion. It has to be governed solely by the other two sources of knowledge, which are empirical knowledge and reason. So our conception of cosmos, our conception of our own existence must be exclusively based upon those two sources of knowledge. And that will guarantee what? Objectivity. Right? So if we can agree upon reason and empirical knowledge as our sources of knowledge, this will lead to an objective approach. And if this objective approach is what? Is accepted by society as a whole, we will have progress. Right? So these concepts are what? Are key to the secularist, atheist, materialist approach to life and the universe. Rejection of revelation, a belief in the objectivity of empirical knowledge and reason, and believing that adoption of these two sources of knowledge exclusively will lead to objectivity, which will lead to progress. Okay? Now, progress is, since it is believed to be an objective phenomenon, has to be accepted by everyone else. So this is another, this leads to another key component of modernity and secularism, which is what? Uniformity. Since the secular, materialist understanding of the cosmos is objective, everybody has to accept it, and everybody has to follow this enlightened paradigm and has to achieve progress through adopting these sources of knowledge. Okay? Now, the issue is, as you all know, human life is quite diverse. Human cultures and civilizations are diverse. So, what if people don't want to go with this enlightened paradigm? Okay? In this case, the answer of modernity has been what? To basically eliminate any opposition to this uniformity. How has this been done? As we'll see soon, it has been done through various means, among the most prominent of which has been the surveillance state, propaganda, and genocide. Through using these means, secular and modern states have tried to produce a uniformity in their societies and in the world. Now, if you look at different secular conceptions, we see that although they agree on the factors that I've mentioned, they disagree about what to do after that. Meaning, if you say reason and empirical knowledge should be the exclusive sources of knowledge, that will tell you certain facts about the universe. But it won't necessarily tell you something about how you should act in that universe. Right? In other words, we can answer, they have an answer to question, what is it? But there has been no consistent answer to the question of what should we do about reality. So you had multiple different secular competing ideologies that try to define what the goal of human life and human society should be, right? Among these have been what? For example, nationalism. Nationalism as a secularist idea is what? That people should not live in before basically nation states. What did we have? We had empires based upon faith, in which many different cultures lived together. Once you have nationalism, you have the breakup of old empires, and you have the idea that people should live with people who speak the same language, have the same history, so on and so forth, right? And that progress is going to be attained through this idea of a nation state. That the nation state serves the interests of the people the best, right? So one understanding, one organization of human society under secularist ideologies was what? Nationalism, right? Another ideology was what? Communism, right? Communism did not look at world history as sort of an arena between different nations. Rather, it saw world history through the lens of economics, through the lens of class struggle, right? So there, it wasn't so much one nation facing another. It was what? One class facing another, right? So they saw struggle. They saw this change from a tribal society that was nomadic to an agricultural society in which the aristocrats enslaved the peasants. And eventually you had the merchant class grow, and this merchant class overtook the aristocracy and established capitalism. They likewise exploited the workers, and eventually the workers are going to defeat the capitalists and have a utopian society in which everyone lives happily ever after, right? That was the communist conception. And they saw what? The religion as basically a sort of opium for the people, that, people have religion because they live miserable lives. So to have some sort of hope, they believe in God. So they thought that once you have a communist society, people won't have miserable lives, and therefore they will have no need to believe in any religion. That was the communist conception of human society and where it's coming from and where it should go, right? You had other ideologies. For example, you have another ideology which is quite common among non-Muslims, which is what? Existentialism. Existentialism, it set the ultimate human goal as being authentic. Meaning the idea is not so much what you believe in, but that you believe what you believe in authentically, and that's what matters. And so this was another sort of ideology that grew within the sphere of secularism, atheism, and materialism. Okay? So now, where did these different models, atheistic, secularist, materialist models, lead to? It led to the greatest period of evil in human history. And I don't mean this subjectively. I say take any objective standard. For example, how can you define a period as evil? Perhaps in the one intuitive measure would be what? In the number of human lives lost, right? More people died in the modern period than any other period in world history. And probably more than the whole of world history combined altogether, right? So how did this start? If you look at this, that in fact the first time atheists took charge of a government was right after French Revolution. Between the years 1793 to 1795, you had an atheist committee which tried to rule France. What did they do? They institute this period called the Reign of Terror. And this wasn't a description of them. They used the word terror themselves. They said that we're going to use terror to shape society according to our vision. So in those 2 years, they killed 16,594 people, according to historical records. Right? Who were these people? Basically people who did not share their vision of society, people who believed in God, which they saw as obstacles against progress, obstacles against an objective concept of enlightenment, and so they said that these people have to go away, right? So we can say atheism, in its very origin, as soon as it gained political power, the first thing it did was commit massacres, commit genocide. Okay? So you have also, afterwards, the United States, which emerged as a secular country. What did the United States history start with? It started with another genocide, right? The genocide of the Native Americans, right? George Washington, the first president of the United States, he advocated genocide against Native Americans. Let me just quote his own words so I don't make a mistake. He was, at the time they were fighting the Native American tribe of the Iroquois. And George Washington, in his own words, wanted, quote, total destruction and devastation of their settlements. Total destruction and devastation of their settlements. So not their defeat as a military power, which one can understand, right? But total devastation and destruction of their settlements, which is basically massacre and genocide. So the history of the United States started with genocide. Okay? We look at other developments in the modern world. What happened is what? Nationalism as a global ideology led to the beginning of World War I. Right? Serbian nationalists started World War I by killing the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And World War I led to deaths of millions of people. Right? After World War I, again, nationalism continued as a global force in Germany. And the Germans saw the interests of the German race as their supreme goal. And they wanted to unify all Germans. And again, this very modern idea of uniformity, that everyone who didn't belong to the German race had to go away, right? So this included, as you know, the Jews, the Gypsies, the Slavs, basically anyone who did not belong to the German race. So 6 million Jews, according to historical records, they say were killed. Much more than that were killed in terms of Russians, right? Up to 20 million Russians were killed in World War II, because Hitler, just as he saw the Jews as an inferior race, he also saw the Slavs as an inferior race. He had this concept of Lebensraum, living space. So he said, we have to create living space for Germans. And how was that going to be done? By exterminating other races, right? Through ethnic cleansing and genocide. So these were the consequences. This devastation, destruction, genocide was the consequence of the modern ideology of nationalism. How about communism? What did it produce? Again, the results were horrible, right? It's interesting that Russians suffered at the hands of their own communist leadership more than they suffered under Germans, right? So communists had this, as we mentioned, this idea that once workers take over and control means of production, you're going to have a utopian society where everybody would be happy. That didn't happen, right? People weren't happy. And so Stalin, who was the second ruler of Russia after Lenin, decided that he would get rid of the segments of society that he didn't find conducive to communism. This led to the famous or infamous Stalin purges. We don't know how many people exactly died in those purges, but according to the own records of the Soviets, between 1937 and 1938, the Soviet state detained more than 1.5 million Russians and Soviet citizens. They killed within 1 year more than 600,000 people. That is a rate of 1,000 people per day. Okay? And this happened under communism in Russia. So Russians suffered more at the hands of communists than they did at the hands of nationalist Germans. Now the total number of people, this is just according to the official records. The total number of people killed under Stalin are not known, but numbers vary between 2 million to 60 million people. Okay? So this was what communism brought to the world. And this wasn't just in Russia. In China, similar things happened. There was the Cultural Revolution under Mao Zedong.
In Russia, they killed millions of Muslims.
Yeah. Muslims and Russians, right?
Yeah.
That there is this idea of uniformity. And so any population that is seen contrary to the idea of the progress that the modernists envision has to be eliminated, right? In China, the similar things happened, right? Again, under Chinese communism during the Cultural Revolution, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists were persecuted. Muslim villages were bombed. Muslims were forced to eat pork, so on and so forth. And China really started to develop after Deng Xiaoping took over and abandoned the radical communism of Mao Zedong, who waged a war against religion under the Cultural Revolution. So it was a similar experience to that of communist Russia. And then in Cambodia, where communists also were in power, you also had a similar story. Between 1975 and 1979, communists there killed between 1.5 million to 3 million people. Estimates vary. Again, this is in the famous Cambodian or infamous Cambodian killing fields, right? So you see that these were the consequences of communism. And as we look into, democracy, capitalist democracy, we don't find a better track record. We saw that the United States history started with genocide, right? Again, estimates are that between 2 to 18 million Native Americans were killed by Europeans after they came over here. And basically the idea in democracy is what? You have representation, so this should take away some of the evils of tyranny that Europeans faced in the time of kingship and aristocracy prior to democracy. But what happened in democracy is, right, oftentimes, basically one ethnic group taking dominance and again exploiting and oppressing other groups according to its own interests. We not only see this with Native Americans in United States history, we also see this with what? African Americans, right? So a very horrendous example of this is what is known in U.S. history as Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This Tuskegee syphilis experiment conducted by the United States government was the longest non-therapeutic medical experiment in human history. And what did they do? They took a total of 600 African Americans. They tested them for syphilis. 399 of them had syphilis. They did not tell them that they had syphilis, so they just watched them die from syphilis. Even after penicillin was discovered and the cure of syphilis was discovered, they conducted this experiment for a period of 40 years. And basically they watched those people go insane and then die. And as some of you might remember, Bill Clinton was the president who finally formally apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So this is what happened within the United States as regards the Native Americans and the African Americans. If we look at the global record, we don't find something, we find a similar pattern, which is what? That again, this concept of uniformity, everybody has to follow one way of life and one system, right? So we see what? That the first and only nuclear genocide was conducted by the United States against Japan, as you know. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they attacked, they nuclearly bombed civilian population. In Hiroshima, 66,000 people died in one day, right? Out of a population of 255,000. In Nagasaki, 39,000 people died. And 69,000 people were injured, and total casualties for each city was 135,000 and 64,000. This was the first incident of nuclear genocide in world history. Right. Now, if we look at chemical genocide conducted by chemical weapons, again we see secular states at the forefront who used chemical weapons as a weapon of genocide. Mussolini, the Italian nationalist leader, right? Mussolini was, like many other European nationalists, was very much affected by the existentialist philosopher Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche said that since religion is gone, we should create our own morality. And this authentic morality, the person who develops this will be a superhuman, an Ubermensch, right? So this sort of idea of creating your own morality very much affected the nationalists in Europe, in Germany, and it also affected Mussolini, right? The existentialist philosopher Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party, and Mussolini said that Nietzsche is the one who turned him from a socialist to a fascist. But Mussolini was the first European ruler I think the first European ruler to use chemical weapons. Hitler also used chemical weapons against civilian population in World War II. As regards Muslim rulers who used chemical weapons against civilian populations, we know of 3 of them. They're all nationalist secularists.